Hey, Nintendo, what's going on? Yeah, I hear that. Just another day, right? Drop too soon. What the hell was that? That was bullshit, is what that is. Well, it does, but it's not like I was going for a world record. I feel like it's that part I don't feel. I think it's 29 minutes, which is... good God. I think I've got it to just under an hour. Realistically, I want to keep shipping it down. Not letting that shit happen again. What the fuck? took way longer than it needed to also. Always love this boss because he does the whole Terminator 2 thing when he's dying. Now it's like I never died at all. So funny thing with this game, this part specifically, normal and then expert, the gargoyle skeletons fly around in the arc that you're doing right now. Whatever side they come out on, they loop around to the other side, and then they'll eventually hone in and just try to attack and knock you off the, whatever you want to call these floating pedestal things. Japanese version, they just fly in a linear line. They just fly left to right. And probably half the speed. A couple of other things that, in stage 6, in the upside down room, you have the invincible glowing balls that rotate around the platforms. There's less of them in the Japanese one, whereas every platform in the American version has one on it. It's one of those weird things where in the 80s and 90s they decided to make games harder in the US, but one of the biggest tropes in gaming has always been that the Japanese games are harder than the American counterparts. That they would dumb them down for us. Reality is that only happened with Nintendo, and specifically with Mario Brothers. Miyamoto said that Americans were too dumb to be able to play Super Mario Brothers 2, which is why we got the version that we got here. And then later on, we'd get on the Super Nintendo with All-Stars, the Lost Levels, which was the real Mario Brothers 2. Other companies, though, decided to just make games harder here. In fact, my wife told me this, Resident Evil Code Veronica in Japan actually had an easy mode that they just removed from the US version of the game. Oh no, yeah, Super Mario Brothers 2 was ridiculously hard. It added in wind, and some of those jumps were literally pixel perfect. Like, I don't... Ooh, that was close. I guess they felt the first game was just too easy. That's just one of those weird little facts that I always liked. Us over here thinking that the Japanese version of the games were always more difficult. The reality is we were actually getting the harder versions of them. Probably. You know, I never actually tried that, to be perfectly honest with you. It's because the trail that it leaves behind is so long. I don't know if you'd land before it was done, but you know what? I'm gonna have to try that the next time, to be honest. You know, all things considered, 24 minutes, about to enter level 5. I'm pretty content with this. Yeah, I always like the look of this stage. Oh, actually, here's another thing. These guys specifically, and the Japanese one, it's 2 hits to kill them. The US version is 3. I'm pretty confident I've never gotten past them without getting hit at least a lot. Too impatient. No, I was trying to sneak past you with invulnerability flames. Frames. The one... No, this isn't the Japanese version. This is the US version. If you're thinking it looks a little different, it's a palette change. It doesn't modify the game in any way except for changing colors. Mostly around Eric, giving him back the blonde hair. No. That's fine. Man, now I'm just really shitting the bed. Yep. Even in the Japanese one, it's weird. All of the cutscenes and the art for him, including the cover of the game, he has blonde hair. And then the in-game model ended up with green hair. But they did alter his art. Wow, I'm speaking right now. They altered his art in the US as well. The Japanese version of him is very Bishonen, so they didn't want players in the US to think that he was a woman. So they made his artwork more masculine in the cutscenes at the end of the game and in the beginning. Yep, exactly. Oh man, I'm gonna die here, aren't I? The other thing that was odd about this game with John Morris, making him the son of Quincy Morris, is that by doing that, they made the Dracula of Castlevania the Dracula from Bram Stoker's Dracula, but for whatever reason, they named him Quincy without an E in his name, like the book, and instead of cutting Dracula's throat with the Bowie knife like he did in the book, they had him putting a stake through his heart. So it's like they combined Nosferatu and Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I also think in the 90s, when this came out in 94, Bram Stoker's Dracula hadn't entered public domain yet. So they may have had to change the name with without the E rather, and with the the wooden stake because of that, but... Although recently I only just learned this and I had no idea. Something I kind of surprised in myself, I just hadn't heard, was that the Nosferatu movie was made and named that specifically because they didn't want to pay Bram Stoker rights for the character Dracula, so they made these more monstrous-looking Draculas, like Nosferatu, and eventually they basically were sued for copyright infringement, and the original Nosferatu film was all but destroyed until found years later. One of those little random facts of, I don't know why I know this, but I do. That said, though, Bram Stoker's Dracula is in the public domain now, so you can actually use all of those characters however you want. The only character that you wouldn't be able to do a specific version of would be Van Helsing, because Universal made that movie with Hugh Jackman, where not only is he a vampire hunter, but he's the reincarnation of the Archangel Lord. That's why he has all of the holy powers. But any other version of Van Helsing you can use. Yeah. This was the room I was talking about. You'll see that each of the platforms coming up have that orb floating around them. Another thing, actually, as I come up on it, it's like it's coming back to me in waves. The death fight. On normal, you get 2 cards that will give you pot roasts to refill your health. On expert, you get none. On easy, you get 2. The Japanese version, normal, you get 2. Easy, you get 3. Expert, you actually get 1. I never, with these, try to hit a specific one in a specific order. Just whatever it is, just get it over with. That was a little too early. Terminator 2, thumbs up. There it is. It's such a nice little Easter egg. Oh, rip. one spear. And use so much more time than needed. That still hit. Alright, if I'm smart, I won't take any damage on Elizabeth. I'm not smart. First attack. Die. You know, if I didn't watch the credits, I would have no idea that that was supposed to be Medusa, because she doesn't shoot any snakes or anything. I thought it was just her monster form. Nope. Credited as Medusa. Of course, I fucked that up. Yeah, it really does. I don't think it was originally designed to be Medusa, and then they realized that they wanted her in the game for some reason. But I think the bigger thing they were focusing on was the tail. The whole thing with the Genesis and its blast core processing was its ability to do certain 3D tricks quite well, actually. So the boss for stage 4, or 3 rather, on top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa with the tail that looks very much like hers. The boss from the first stage, all the joints and movements on the sprite. The Genesis was able to do this weird thing where it can manipulate sprites as individual pieces to create that 3D effect. arguably Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo ended up being the better technology, but it, you know, came out 2 years later. That and then the FX chip was eventually released. The Genesis had some cool tricks up its sleeve. And then despite having a weaker sound chip, depending on the game, the music actually sounded better than the Super Nintendo counterparts. That's because Sega was very much focused on arcades more than anything, so the Genesis hardware was built around their arcade board hardware so that they could easily port their arcade games onto the console. I didn't want the holy water. Well, when I say inferior, it had less audio channels available to it. Similar to the Nintendo having only 5 audio tracks in the US for the ROM versions, whereas the Famicom Disk System allowed the VRC6 chip to add more sound tracks onto it. The big one you would see the difference there would be Castlevania 3. So yeah, it's not that it's weaker, it's a different sound technology altogether, but it did have less audio channels, which made it a little more challenging. But the music in this game, I think, is one of the best examples of what this thing was capable of doing. Pugsy and Wizzliz. I'll check them out. $53 minutes, 42 seconds. Not bad. I'll take it. Oh, here's another thing. The ending, again, in the US. This is the version you get for beating it on normal. On Expert, there's an extra cutscene after that. Japanese version, you beat it on normal, you get the full ending. What I also find incredibly interesting about the Japanese version, and I actually had to look into this a little, was the entire game is in English. There's no translation in-game. Everything is English. I was like, well, that kind of sucks for people that were playing it over there. You know, but in Japan, they're actually taught English for 6 years. And I didn't even think about it when I was researching this, with how many symbols there are for kanji and katakana for writing. There's, I think, 3 forms of writing in Japanese. It's like, yeah, what's the big deal about adding in an extra 26 Roman characters? I'm like, oh, all right. Well, I guess when you look at it that way. But they also thought it was more authentic to have it in English because it took place in Europe, the game. It's like, oh, all right. But also, during that research, the instruction manual for the Japanese version of the game actually had a full translation of everything. So the opening cutscene scroll, the credits, and the final cutscene. There's Michiru Yamane. Her first Castlevania game. The director of this game was impressed with the music that she was doing for Konami on a per diem basis and thought she would do great for this. The rest is history now, as she arguably made the best soundtracks for the franchise. Had her shoot snakes instead of the weird fireballs. But again, like Castlevania 4, they're like, well, let's do the cool shit that we could do with the system's hardware. I just think it worked a little bit better in this game. Now tell me to go play it on expert mode. A winner is you. Alright, well, thank you everyone for watching. I'm going to keep trying to get this time down. I think 53 minutes might actually put me in the top 20, believe it or not, which I don't think a lot of people speedrun this game. But I know the fastest time is definitely like 29 minutes, and there's some weird shit you can do with Eric. I know in the room with the, in stage 4, with the, I guess the large pistons, you can time your super jump to get hit by the first one, and it just bolts you right onto the next screen. So that saves like 15 seconds, but not 15, maybe 10. But oh yeah, no, this game is 100% underrated. The problem that this game faced was that this and Contra Hard Corps released the same year in '94 on the Genesis, but '94 we're already pretty far into Nintendo's dominance on the entire market, right? So most households were calling every video game system that their kids had a Nintendo, and that kind of lasted until like almost the early 2000s, where your kids were just playing the Nintendo. But Castlevania and Contra were never on any Sega system. They were always on Genesis. So by the time this came, on Nintendo platform, so by the time this came out in '94, we already had Castlevania 1, 2, 3, Rondo of Blood, and Castlevania 4 having previously released. So if you didn't have a PC engine, and you didn't have any of the Nintendo systems, yes, it's supposed to be a little throwback to Simon, but believe it or not, that's Trevor and Sypha. Because at this point, they weren't really sure if they wanted to give a shit about Christopher Belmont, even though he's obviously mentioned in the first game, and then you get the Game Boy games, but the first one notoriously was terrible. The second one was better, but they never really acknowledged Christopher, so at the start of this game, they put Trevor and Sypha, because most people would recognize them. But again, people that in '94, if you were a Genesis person, you never had a Nintendo system. Like, you probably started with the Sega Genesis in '89, or I think only like 15 people in the US had a Master System. You may not have had a Nintendo, which came out in '85 in the US, so you started with the Genesis. The rivalry back then between the two systems was like palpable. Like, you could cut that tension with a knife. And the two companies kind of like leaned into it, especially Sega. I mean, their commercials back then were amazing. It was always Sega does what Nintendo don't. They'd always just shit talk Mario. So, if you had a Genesis and you saw Castlevania and Contra, the first thing you're going to think on a store shelf is, those are Nintendo games, and I'm not buying them because... So, he's not playable, but that's him and Sypha from 3 overlooking the original destruction that they did, because as far as this game was concerned, the Game Boy ones never happened, or they're just not acknowledged. So they show the first 2 ancestors of the Belmonts, because John Morris and his father Quincy are supposed to be Belmonts, but the reason their last name is Morris is that they're from the female side of the family. So one of Trevor's daughters, who would have married somebody with the last name Morris, and it's why, if you ever play Portrait of Ruin, which is a direct sequel to this game, they explain in that John died because he couldn't use the vampire killer to its full potential without draining his life, because he was from the other side of the family. So that side of the family never wielded the vampire killer, so there's a curse on it that anybody, it's like it knows it's his blood, but he's not a direct descendant of a male Belmont. So there was a curse, and you have to break it in Portrait of Ruin when you get the real ending, after you figure out how to kill Bernhard instead of or stopping Bernhard to save the 2 women who turn out to be Eric Lecarde's daughters, and the guy Wind in that game is Eric Lecarde from this game, who was killed and stays around as a ghost. They explained that there was a curse for anybody that wasn't a Belmont that could use the whip. Yeah, that's Portrait of Ruin is the sequel, the one on the DS with Johnny Morris, or Jonathan Morris. That's what I was just talking about. Like, the game opens up and the girl's like, oh, you know, he can't use the vampire killer, ha ha ha. And then you find out why later on in the game when you do the second half of the game after you, do the stuff in the game to where it doesn't end when you kill Bernhard and the 2 girls. It's when you save them and reverse the vampirism, you find out there's a curse on it. You break the curse, and then he's able to use the vampire killer against Dracula at the end. So yeah, I thought that was cool that Igarashi decided to keep this game and the Morris family like part of the lore, as opposed to just saying, well, that was on the Genesis and no one really played it anyway, let's just scrap it. In fact, this game's not even called... in Japan, the franchise is called Akamaju Dracula. In Japan, this game, the Genesis one specifically, it's not even called that. It's just literally called Vampire Killer. It doesn't have the Castlevania name. It doesn't have Akamaju Dracula, because they were afraid that no one would buy it because they wouldn't recognize the name, so they gave it a more generic name to make it sound a little more edgy. So they called it Vampire Killer, and they didn't use Belmonts in the game directly, because if the game completely tanked, they could just completely disassociate it from the entire franchise. And they could even argue that in the beginning that wasn't Trevor and Sypha. So yeah, like, and then the same thing with Contra Hard Corps. They weren't sure how it was going to play out. So they didn't put Lance and, oh my god, how did I forget his name? Lance and... Oh well. You know who I'm talking about. Guys from Contra. That's why they're not in the Genesis version, and they put 2 new human characters, and the robot, and then the furry. Because if they needed to, they could just disassociate it from the franchise. Fun little things. that will do it for me tonight. I'm an old man, and yeah, I'm going to bed. So thank you everyone for watching. And yes, for anyone who is reading the text in this, yes, this is not the original text. This is part of the palette swap for the game. As you can see, it's a little more telling about the story. They used the right name for Elizabeth Bartley, who was based on Elizabeth, but it didn't change any of the gameplay. Anyway, have a good night, everybody.